Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Tuesday, July 22nd, 2025, episode 444. And this episode is a little bit edgier than perhaps even my race episodes, but it's going to be rape culture in dog parks. It's not actually, well, it was a fake journal submission made by James Lindsay, who's going to be the focus of our discussion today. And the title of one of his papers that he submitted was Rape Culture in Dog Parks, or him and uh, a couple of his friends, academic friends. But anyway, four, you might know, before we get into it, four, you might know, is a very unlucky number in the East. In the West, we have the number 13, right? Friday the 13th. Oh, this is really bad. But the number 13 is not good luck, apparently. And in Korea and Asian countries in general, the number four is very bad. So you don't want to live on the fourth floor. You're going to have bad luck. Bad things are going to happen to you. On the flip side, the number eight is supposed to be really, really lucky. So, if you recall, the Olympics in Korea was held in 1988. That was really sort of very key for them. But anyway, uh, I wanted to do something special. I couldn't think of anything, and this sort of just happened. So why not make rape culture in dog parks episode 444? Or this is just a clickbait title, right? I had lunch or brunch today with a former colleague, and eventually, after we exchanged war stories of our time in the program that we used to teach in together, he's still there. But so that's why we were exchanging stories. But in any case, the discussion eventually turned to Epstein, the Epstein list. And then I thought I didn't know him that well, so I didn't want to raise an issue that was too controversial. But then, since he seemed to react favorably to the whole Epstein so-called list phenomena, I raised the issue of MAPS, minor attracted persons, the whole trans phenomena, and how it seems like a lot of people are trying to dictate a new normal. Like, on the one hand, you have people maintaining the idea that children are innocent, they're unable to give consent. And then on the other hand, their opinions have the legitimacy of adults. So even small children who can barely talk can express that they don't uh, think that they're the right gender. And so they can be whisked away to have gender transitioning treatment of various levels and degrees. You also have this strange conflict of voting age versus the age of cigarette purchasing and alcohol purchases, right? So it's weird, right? We have this strange inconsistency when it comes to the way that we talk about children, the way we treat children. And it's very strange to me, to say the very least. Um, so I think this is kind of a trend in our society. And I've talked about it in sort of tangentially in in other episodes. But it seems to me that what James Lindsay did with a bunch of his colleagues, associates, was kind of along this line. So I saw a video, watched the interview that John Stossel had with James Lindsay. I think he must have come out with a recent book or something, but they were just talking about the woke right and how the woke left, which gave us trans and maps and BLM. Well, uh, the pushback eventually came, and now we also have uh, on the right a bunch of woke people doing largely the same thing. But just to give some background, back in 2017 and 2018, James Lindsay, along with Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, submitted something like 20 articles for publication at academic journals. Now, I have to say that many people, when they to write a single journal article requires months and months of work. And these three cranked out 20 articles. I don't know how long it took them, but they cranked out 20 articles that are not real. They just made them up, ridiculous topics to see if they can get them published. And their topics covered critical social theory, like culture, queer, race, gender, fat, and sexuality studies, right? Topics that most people outside of the university have never even heard of, but they're really big and trendy in the university. In fact, if you somehow tie in your research and scholarship with one of these, you can be assured some sort of employment or maybe even getting published. Maybe not the employment part so much, but generally getting published and getting some kind of recognition for it. And yes, I know my PhD uh, dabbled in race theory, but my conclusions were not the type that would have attracted a lot of popular opinion from the liberal left. Nevertheless, they wanted to expose the problems in what they called grievance studies, right? A culture where only certain conclusions are allowed. I'm getting most of this information from Wikipedia, just so you know. And so they wanted to raise awareness of the damage of postmodernism and identity politics. And just as a sort of an insert here as a footnote, you all know I'm a self-proclaimed postmodernist. And I've said before in other episodes that I think most people misunderstand postmodernism, misuse it. And so I'm guessing that because he seemed to me a really smart guy, and for him and two other people to crank out 20 articles, yeah, fake as they were, they had to look legit. And so you had to do all this research and data collection to be able to do it. And to crank it out in a matter of weeks or months instead of years is impressive. I mean, those guys have to be super smart, top of their game, really understand what they're talking about. But and I think that's what James Lindsay and his buddies uh, are meaning when they talk about postmodernism, right? It's the abuse of postmodernism, whereas postmodernism, and I've read all those guys, you know, Derrida and all those guys that talk about it all the time. They seem like they're saying lots of different things, but to put it very simply, postmodernism is just exposing the subjectivity, right? Where did information come from? It came from a very specific subjective perspective. And so postmodernism is just simply revealing that subjectivity, revealing that subjective perspective. And so either you're going to go along with it, right? Share that perspective, share that point of view, or find something else, right? Create a different subjectivity, establish a different point of view. And I've talked about how the ability to understand this process can enable us to get out of our box, can innovate, can create something new, can realize that what we think is a huge problem is not a problem at all. So postmodernism, I think, has a very valuable, um, it's a very valuable tool, but that's all it is a tool. It's not a truth, a way to get at the truth. It's just simply an examination of subjectivity. Okay, footnote over. So some of the papers that him and his buddies were able to submit and have accepted, right? So these certain academic journals read these papers, and and these papers they submitted, these 20 papers, are in competition with hundreds of other papers, right? Because that's what you need to do in scholarship, whether as a grad student or as a PhD, right? You have to get published, and that's how you get recognition. That's how you're going to get employment, a teaching position somewhere. You have to publish. Um, and so the 20 papers that they submitted were in competition. You have to imagine with hundreds and hundreds of other papers to be published in their monthly journal or their biannual journal, right? So it's not like it comes out every week. So competition is really, really stiff, uh, you know, to get published. All right, so here are some of the titles that were submitted. So they submitted 20. These were four of the titles that were accepted and published, right? Of the 20, others were accepted and were pending, others were under review, and a whole bunch of them were rejected out of hand. But anyway, I think it was their success rate was better than 500. So I think more than half of their papers were either accepted, under review, which means it passed one or two stages of evaluation. And then I think a bunch of them were about to be published. Okay, so here are some of the titles. And I probably am going to change the title because just in case some of my old middle school students are listening, I don't want their parents to call me out. Anyway, so here it is. Human reactions to rape culture and queer performativity at urban dog parks in Portland. Whew. Wow, that's a mouthful, but also basically they were examining dog behavior and relating it to rape culture. Next one is, who are they to judge? Overcoming anthropometry and a framework for fat bodybuilding, right? So I guess this is for that fat journal. Going in through the back door, and I'm just going to not read the rest of the title. I think it's basically a paper addressing trans phobia and how you can somehow get over it through the use of toys through the back door. I'll leave it like that. Okay. But anyway, the next one is an ethnography of restaurant masculinity. Themes of objectification, sexual conquest, male control, and masculine toughness in a sexually objectifying restaurant, right? It was accepted and published, right? And I think all of them were later withdrawn, right? That now that when the hoax was revealed, then they came clean. And so all of the other articles, even if they were about to be published, they were withdrawn, right? So they were not published. And what's so crazy is that if you weren't aware that these were hoaxes, like you read them like they were real legitimate papers, you'd be like, yeah, this is a great take. I never thought of that. This is really great. That's what people would say. I know because I was in the university and I would hear people talk about this stuff all the time. So I talked about James Lindsay in class pretty frequently, right? I wanted them to realize that just because a PhD wrote something doesn't mean that it's the truth, that it is, that it's information that cannot be questioned, right? It came on from the authorities who know a lot more than us, and so we must submit to the information that they're giving us. And it was part of this whole attempt that I would try to present that facts are just simply information that subjectively considered to have some kind of value or some kind of truth content. but a lot of this information can be undermined simply by changing your subjectivity. So to treat information as, and so just so you know, I did that so that we could have a discussion, right? Let's begin the discussion by saying there's no truth. So now you have to persuade each other in terms of what might be beneficial or not. And this set the playing field so that everyone gets to have a legitimate voice in the discussion, right? You can't cancel anyone. You can't shut anyone down. You can't censor anyone because all of us are ignorant, right? That was our starting point, and it allowed me to have some really interesting discussions, and it forced a lot of people to be more open-minded and or even to realize that they were closed-minded, right? So I talked about it, how they were hoaxes, they were published as if they were legitimate. But if you think about it, they are legitimate, right? Because they did everything the way they were supposed to. And from that subjectivity, these were legitimate papers, right? Which should make you wonder what is considered scholarship these days. And I would bring it and discuss it in the context of broken science. Reason magazine, I think it was in 2016, devoted nearly an entire issue on broken science. And what it talked about was how certain fields in science, a lot of the research is fake, right? You can't repeat the experiments. And so therefore, probably someone fudged the data, right? But no one cares, right? Because once it's published in scientific journals, no one checks it. And then other people are going to use those published articles as jumping off points for other things to say that they want to do. So, for example, the whole secondhand smoke, I've talked about this before, but secondhand smoke is not really a thing. But even to this day, people talk about secondhand smoke. And then crack babies, that also was made up as well. But again, a lot of people have built their careers on this phenomena of crack babies, right? And it did wonders for the DEA, right, Drug Enforcement Agency, and criminalization of a lot of drug users. So you have all of this stuff that's going on in the left, right? Uh, where to the point where we're going to call them woke, right? So the woke left. And what does woke mean? Heightened awareness, right? I'm woke, like I know what's really going on, okay? And then it changed, right, as it moved forward, that it's basically an application of Marxism to further some sort of agenda, right? To achieve the perfect Marxist state, right? Communist, you can call it communist, fascist, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's all a form of Marxism, right? So they're all different varieties of Marxism. And it's not just on the left. This is what the point of the interview between John Stossel and James Lindsay was, that it wasn't just on the left, but it's also on the right. And he talked about how he submitted an article, James Lindsay did, to the American Reformer, which is a right wing um, publication, but that's also considered woke right. And what he did was the article that he submitted for that was that he basically plagiarized 6 pages of the Communist Manifesto. And he all he did was change certain words to sort of capitalist sounding words, right? So he would take out words like bourgeoisie, proletariat, and replace it with something else. But otherwise, word for word, it's the Communist Manifesto. And they published it. And then one of the readers, I think it was like the New York Times or something like that, a reader pointed out that this was essentially the Communist Manifesto. And when they outed him, they said, yes, but this is exactly what we believe. And so they did not retract it, which tells you that the woke right is also left, right? If we're going to characterize Marxism as left, well, then the woke right is also left. And so basically, it's a different version of Marxism. And what they said, this was James Lindsay said, he said that The problem with the woke left is that they leave out national identity. And so we are national socialists. Yes, if you know what Nazi stands for or where it comes from, and I've talked about this many times, but all Nazi is, Nazi, are the first four letters of the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterspartei, right? And so basically the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Okay. So they're National Socialists. So essentially they're saying, yes, yes, we are Nazis, right? And they mix in a lot of Christian terms, to make it tempting and palatable, I guess, for a lot of Christians. But that their use of Christian terms is a lot of subjectively bad interpretations of scripture in the sense that they'll zero in on a couple of verses and then ignore the rest of the scripture, right? But that's the world we live in, right? I've talked about this recently, a bad definition world, right? The world of bad definitions. So that's the woke right. They're basically just like the woke left, except they're focusing on different issues, but the methodology is exactly the same. So the pushback to the woke left basically is more of the same. It's the same. And I wonder, now that I listen to James Lindsay, I wonder if the university lawyer was trying to imply that I was somehow woke right, that I was a Nazi, right? Because she did ask me the question, do you know that people call you a racist? So now that I think about it, maybe that's what she was going for. So the woke left, woke right, it comes from the failed ideas of Karl Marx. And James Lindsay, he was funny because John Stossel didn't pick it up at the moment, but he published under the name Marcus Carlson, right? So Karl Marx backwards, right? And basically, so the woke right and the woke left, they're basically versions of communism. And I've always talked about it, and I have several episodes on the Communist Manifesto. But Marx's problem is that it's an oversimplification. Everyone in the world is either or. Either you are part of the ruling class or you're part of the proletariat, the worker class, right? But we know that there are many other different classifications in society, right? Like children, for example. But in any case, so it's oversimplification into what I would call broad racial categories. And we know because racial categories are just simply generalizations, that it ignores the individual, the uniqueness of individuals within that categorization, which then leads to many, many kinds of problems, which is why Marxism never works, because you're going to try to live life as a generalization, not as an individual. And it all falls apart when you get into the everyday living aspect of life, right? How do I go about doing what I need to do? Oh, there's no information here, but my choices are only limited to a binary understanding of the world. And of course, in that mindset, you just have institutional collapse. But anyway, so you make this oversimplification of the world into this either you're with us or you're against us, either you're racist or anti-racist. The stupid binary, sort of low intelligence, low IQ way of looking at the world. Um, and I call it low IQ because uh, if that's the way you're going to do everything in terms of a binary, well, yeah, that's not going to work, right? So that's why I think it's the only way you can live that way, truly live that way, is if, you know, you can't think of anything else. There is nothing else, right? And that's the lack of creativity that comes along with communist thinking, this sort of Marxist thinking. So how do you make this go down easy with people? Well, you make it sound nice by virtue signaling, right? Oh, we're going to fight for the workers. We're going to fight for the downtrodden and the masses that are abused by the elite. You make it sound good that way. But really, yeah, it just falls apart because there are no details. There's no specificity within this this way of looking at the world. And so that's why it never has any solutions, real solutions to everyday problems. Thankfully, James Lindsay, is pro-freedom, right? Um, so he is trying to fight for, it seemed he made the statement kind of lengthy at the end of the interview that he's all about freedom, that we need more freedom. And that the hoax scholarship that he submitted to these so-called legitimate academic journals, they are not examples of free scholarship, right? People who are not people who are free thinking, independent thinking, they can't be published, right? Because their conclusions are unacceptable. So one might ask, in a free society, how do universities and scholarship of this type, how are they perpetuated? Well, it's because of all the government money through student loans, right? They're the ones that in part fund and fuel all of this very fringe, if not extreme, not normal in terms of not in the mainstream kind of thinking. And most people would ignore it, except that it's subsidized and it's funded by taxpayer dollars. And so even though it doesn't turn a profit, even though it cannot generate any kind of revenue, it doesn't have to, because as I said, it subsidizes, right? So all of the losses are covered up because we're paying taxes to pay for all of this stuff. And so people who write within this framework, as long as it is consistent with their own thinking, then subjectively speaking, it's legitimate. But for the rest of us who don't live in that world, in that closed-minded, tiny little world that we call a small box, well, there's no interest for us at all. And so all those 20 papers that were submitted as hoaxes are legit in that world, right? So to us, it's a hoax, it's a gag, but to them, it's legitimate. And as I always said in class, everyone is free to believe whatever it is that they want to believe. But if what you think is true does not make society better, then more likely than not, it will be an idea that is forgotten by the vast majority of people, right? So we need freedom to hash out what in fact has value and what doesn't have value. And it's not simple. And I've talked about morality discovery, how it's similar to price discovery in economics, but it's only through interaction with other ideas and other people who have other ideas that we can figure out what in fact is the best way, the most beneficial way, the most profitable way of doing anything, where there might be some short-term losers, but overall as a society, we all benefit, right? And so we live in a world now where the president of the United States is calling the Epstein list a hoax, right? Where the uh, trafficking of children, the abuse of children is now a hoax. And that sort of fits in how I began this whole episode with the way that the world is trying to reestablish a new normal, right? And it is so far from normal that it should really cause us to be concerned, to understand it at least first, so that we can dismiss it and tell other people how it is really not good in any way. Anyway, that's as politely as I can put it. And now I will say I will talk to you next time and put an end to this really controversial episode. Talk to you next time.